This past year, 2019, we have gone to 6 communities. I've curated art shows in every community with local artists answering the question, what does it mean to be American? And then organized dinners for 50 to 80 people in each city across the political spectrum and engaging in conversation. The cool thing is, everywhere we go, we learn something different. I mean, we started with like sort of a model and tried to adapt that model in each place. But then we would learn new things that we would bring to the next city. So I feel like the last city or the last community, which was Northwest Arkansas, was in a way kind of the most successful because I took everything we learned and put it into this one model of how to engage in conversation with people who are different from you. So a lot of times people ask me, like, what are the steps? What is the process? And it's really hard for me to talk about process because I'm a very sort of feelings-driven person, and I have a hard time with details and rules and regulations. And so it's hard for me to share, like, okay, step 1, do this, step 2. So I did sit down, though, and come up with sort of a set of ground rules that people should start with when they're having conversations, when they're having difficult conversations. I collected all of these from just reading a bunch of material, research, listening to podcasts. Like, I just collected them. So here's the thing. I'm just like this regular person who had an interest in having these kind of conversations, and I sought out information on how to do it. But I guess I just really want to emphasize the fact that, like, all of us can do it. In fact, most of us were taught most of these skills when we were little kids. Like, didn't somebody in your life when you were little say, hey, let everybody have a turn to talk, be polite, things like that. And somehow some of us have forgotten those rules. And now we're yelling at each other and we're not letting people have a turn to talk and telling people they're stupid. Like, we know that we're not supposed to do that. And so some of my ground rules are like as basic as that. Be kind to one another, things like that. But I think that there's some other really great rules that I've culled from different sources that I think were really helpful to me when I started trying to have these conversations. This idea of having humility. And it's sort of a subset of being curious, because when you're curious, you're sort of admitting that you don't know something. And so if you have a little humility about it, then you're more likely to ask questions to learn more. And so I think those kind of go together. First and foremost, be curious. But to be truly curious, you need to have a little bit of humility and to be able to admit that you don't know something. And that's really hard to do in our society now because we don't give a lot of room for people to be wrong. We're not very forgiving when people are wrong. We start screaming at them and telling them they're stupid when in fact, it's just a moment in which people are trying to learn. And when you're asking these kinds of questions, you're becoming a better person. You're growing through asking these questions. And so when we shut people down from being able to ask those questions, nobody grows. We're stunted in our growth. And so I think not only being humble, but allowing others the room for growth, for being able to ask these questions and for being able to admit that they're wrong. I am a very competitive person, and so this next one is really hard for me, has been really hard for me to learn. Winning is not the goal of these conversations. We all want to win. We all want to persuade the other person of our view and be victorious in having done that persuasion. And I think that if you go into these conversations with the idea that we are just here to learn, listen, understand, nothing more, then and not try to win, I think that these conversations will be much more meaningful and will actually get to places where solutions are possible. But if we're trying to win, I mean, this goes along with that piece about being humble. You don't necessarily have the right answer. you think you do, but you don't necessarily have the right answer. That's a very egotistical way to look at the world, is to think that your answer is the absolute truth. And I think that that's another thing that I've also been grappling with, that I've been trying to teach myself to be more open to, is that people can have completely opposite views of the world and both be 100% correct in their view of the world. It's a really hard one for me to get my head around. I'm still working on it, but we have to be willing to accept that somebody else's experience shaped the way they see the world, and you cannot question a person's life experience. It is what it is, and it shaped them in that way, and it's different from yours. And we have to accept that there's a possibility that you're not 100% right. You might still be 75% right, but that 25% is where the possibilities for change can take place. One of the most important things when you're going into these kinds of difficult conversations is to make sure that you go in believing that other people have good intentions. You have good intentions, so let's assume that other people have good intentions. And when they say something that is diametrically opposed to one of your beliefs, that does not mean they are a bad person. They are not your enemy. They simply believe something different. And I think it's incumbent on us to ask, why? Why do you believe that? And when we can do that kind of exploration, we can peel away these layers that show that we're all very complex, and there are so many ways of looking at things, and nothing, this is one of the things that I've learned from doing these dinners over the last 3 years, is having these conversations over and over. So many times, people were not as I expected them to be, and nobody I have met so far has been 100% one way or the other. Like, I have not met, I'm sure those people exist, but they're definitely in the minority, because it's just not human to be completely one way or another. It just doesn't make sense. A couple more things that I think are really important to remember when you're having these conversations is that your political identity is far from the most important thing about you. So that's why I think it's so important to begin conversations with something other than what your politics are. Who cares, really, at the end of the day? Because in our day and age, saying that you're a Republican or Democrat is actually sort of useless. Those things mean so many different things now. So I think it's really important not to start with that, and in fact, maybe never even get to that. And finally, I think that we just have to acknowledge that these are really hard conversations. It's really awkward and uncomfortable, and very few people love having these kind of conversations. I happen to be one of the weird people that love having these conversations, but I have come to realize that I can't expect everybody to just jump right in. And so I think what's helpful is to just acknowledge this is going to be really uncomfortable, but it's really important to do. And if I don't do it, who else is going to do it? Like, we have to begin with you, me, each of us individually taking charge and just having one conversation at a time and just starting the conversations. That's, I think, the most important thing to take away from all of this. Is just start and just have one conversation. When people think about having good conversations, they think about it as asking a lot of questions. And it's absolutely important. I mean, I've been saying it over and over. Ask questions, be curious, so important. But I think having a really good conversation also entails you sharing. You have to share your own stories and experiences. You can't only be asking questions. That's not a conversation. A conversation is back and forth. So when you're asking questions and you're doing good listening, it's really important to listen without trying to think about how you want to respond to something the other person has said. It's so easy to fall into that trap. And so then that kind of distracts you from deeply listening to what the person is saying. And so what I usually tell people is, one, listen without thinking about how you're going to respond. But two, more importantly, listen with the compassion with which you wish to be heard. Think about how you want people to hear you. And that's how you should, you know what? Think about it as the golden rule. Do unto others as you would have done to you. And that's how you should listen to others. Sometimes I find it helpful to have like a little blank piece of paper, in front of me, so I can just quickly jot down an idea that pops into my head. That way it kind of gets out of my head so I can keep listening. I'll add a third point too, is, I think that people are so uncomfortable with quiet moments and awkward pauses. Like, we're so into banter and back and forth. And so I think it's really important for us to have a moment of pause. Like, the person you're speaking to has said something. I think it's so important to have a moment where you kind of process what they've just said. You don't have to respond right away. You don't necessarily have a great answer right away. And I feel like a lot of times we just start talking because we want to fill in that space. And we don't have to fill in that space. That's one of the hardest things to practice. I have a hard time with that too. I love witty banter. And so I'm always like, back and forth. It's so cool. In the end, it's really important to just lean into those awkward pauses and just let the moment sit for a moment. Sometimes we're having these conversations and they stay on that superficial level. And that is frustrating to me. I think that, I tend to go kind of personal very quickly. And I know that that's not necessarily comfortable for everyone, but I also feel like we don't actually have that much time with people. And so the sooner we can get right into the personal details, the better. Because at the end of the day, the superficial stuff doesn't really get us anywhere. And so I think that some questions that could be helpful that you might want to try. These might not work for everybody, but these are the kinds of questions that you could experiment with. For example, what is an opinion that you hold that is surprising? So I think that for me, especially in a political context, it's kind of interesting when you ask, for example, for me, I am very much against building a border wall, for example. But I also think that we do need to have I believe in borders. I think that that's what makes us who we are. That's what makes a country, is the border. And so I do think we need a border, and I do think that we need to have some controls across that border. I also think that we should be very expansive in those kinds of controls, but it makes sense to me that we have those controls. And so I think that a lot of times people who are more right-leaning are surprised by that opinion, because they think that us liberals think that we should just open up all the borders and let everybody in. And that's not what I believe. Another question you could ask is, what matters most to you? That's a pretty big question, but again, it just gets at something a little bit deeper than, what did you do last night when you went out, over the weekend, whatever. What matters to you?